Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are just quickly admitting everyone from the waiting room. Apologies for being 2 minutes late. It is now 10 a.m., so we're ready to kick off. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this very exciting session. Today, this is the fourth in our webinar series, looking at providing a foundation level of knowledge on climate-related financial disclosure in South Africa. So we're very excited to have you with us. And for those of you that have joined some of the other sessions, welcome back. For those of you that are new, we'll give you a thorough introduction to the project, and then we'll get into the interesting stuff. Today's session is very exciting. We've done a lot of background information up until this point, but today we're going to start looking at exactly how do you determine the impact of climate risk, and how do you analyze, and then how do you effectively disclose that. So the session, just a couple of admin issues. If you don't mind, if you can please keep your microphones on mute and your videos off if you're not speaking. It would be great if you could post your questions in the chat box. There will be a formal Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but we will also stop between sections to give chance for comments and for questions. So there'll be ample opportunity for you to ask your questions. But if you pop them in the chat, then obviously our esteemed speakers get a chance to prepare their responses, and then you get more rich answers. This webinar will be recorded and will be shared to all participants, so no need to make frantic notes. The slides will also be shared. If you experience any technical difficulties, if you can please give our colleague Safako, drop him an email at safako@apros, and he will sort them out for you. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. I realize it's you're all very busy, and in this new online world, I know the time is now at a premium. So who would have thought this would be the case 2 years ago? So yeah, so today's session, as I said, I'll start off with a quick introduction about the project, then first about our gracious funder, then about the project we're working on, and then we'll get into the meat of the questions and the topics. And as you can see, there's lots of time on the agenda for questions, and we want to make this a very interactive session. So first, just to welcome you all, to introduce me, I'm Brent Klitter. I'm from DNA Economics, and we are the project lead on this UK PACT funded project. UK PACT is the Partnership for Accelerated Climate Transitions. It's a UK government fund. It's aimed at supporting emerging nations in transitioning to low carbon economies. And particularly in order for them to achieve their nationally determined contributions and to meet the Paris Agreement goals. Now, very importantly, it's a demand-driven project. So all the projects, the funding responded to proposals from country from the country representatives, and for all these projects, the demand ultimately came from the beneficiaries. So the project is really trying to fund identified needs, and it's not pushing an agenda. So it does this by working with partner countries to improve their capacity of key institutions in order to reduce emissions, and also to foster inclusive growth. And that's a very important part of this funding program, as it is focused at a low climate transition and wanting to be an inclusive transition. Furthermore, it's also focused on addressing the barriers and constraints to clean growth, and then obviously also for translating all of that into increased ambition and a quicker transition to low carbon growth. The project is operating in a number of countries. So the South African program is one of a number of countries. As you can see, there are also country programs running in China, Colombia, Malaysia, and Mexico. So we're very, very fortunate to be one of this select group of countries that receive UK PACT funding. There's also a Green Recovery Challenge Fund that's been implemented as part of UK PACT. So in addition to the country programs, and then there's also skills secondments, where the UK government is facilitating the deployment of experts, to the emerging nations and the institutions in order to support the aims of the program. Now, in terms of the South African program, it was launched in July last year. 10 projects have been funded for this first round of funding. As you can see, more than £3 million of funding have been deployed. Most of the funding is in terms of renewable energy and supporting the energy transition, and also as that relate to inclusive growth. There's also a number of sustainable transport projects, and then there's 2 sustainable finance projects, of which the project we are representing today is one of those two projects. There is a website where you can get all the information on UK PACT and on all the different country programs, and also the contact details for the program. So yeah, as I said, there's a number of sources. There's the UK PACT country program sources. There's also the UK PACT general information page that gives you all the information on what's happening in South Africa. And then also as part of this project, we also have a central web hub where we're uploading all our resources and information, and there's also links from there to the UK PACT project. So yeah, we would like to acknowledge our funder. We're very excited to be part of this this multi-country program, and we're hoping that this can really support South Africa's transition to a low carbon economy. Okay, so that's the general background. We'll give you a quick introduction to the project, what we're trying to achieve in this specific project. So our project is really trying to address the barriers that is at this stage is preventing the analysis and reporting of climate risks and opportunities in line with with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure. In order to do that, we brought together a consortium of international and local skills. So we wanted to get international best practice in terms of TCFD reporting and analysis, and then also combine it with a very deep understanding of the South African mitigation landscape and climate change landscape, but also ESG trends and capabilities in South Africa. So essentially what this project is trying to do is to speed up the use of detailed, useful and time-based climate-related financial disclosure in South Africa in order to start influencing investment decisions. So we want to start moving investments towards lower carbon and transition-aligned assets. And in doing that, we'll obviously want to try and avoid stranded assets and below expected returns. The focus of this first project, or this first phase of the project, is on the transition risk. And if you've been to the other sessions, you'll know what that means. So it's all around the low carbon transition and the risks and opportunities that holds for companies. We're also focusing on listed equities, and particularly on the pension fund and asset management industries in this stage of the project. Although we are also looking at physical risk in terms of the prerequisites for doing a similar project to this on physical risk during a future phase. Now, again, we're trying to do this project as a demand-led process. So we're engaging very widely, and we're always open for input. And we would love to hear from you if you have any information or suggestions or comments you'd like to share with us. As I mentioned, we pulled together a strong consortium of local and international skills. So as I mentioned, I'm from DNA Economics, and we're also working with a company in Cape Town called The Greenhouse, who are sustainability engineers. Together, DNA and The Greenhouse has more than a decade of working on climate change policy in South Africa. So we thought we wanted to translate those skills into knowledge that could be imparted on the financial sector in order to use this the kind of all the policy work that's been done in South Africa over more than a decade now, to translate that into useful information that can be used in terms of TCFD analysis and disclosure. We have also partnered with Vivid Economics based in the UK. Vivid and their sister company Planetrix have done a lot of the global leading work on climate-related analysis and disclosing the risks and in terms of the TCFD framework. So they've done the similar analysis for some of the world's largest financial institutions in a number of jurisdictions, and also for a number of the multilateral initiatives looking at climate-related financial risk and opportunity. And then also we're very lucky today to have speakers from the WWF South Africa here. Of course, WWF South Africa brings a wealth of both international and local knowledge in terms of climate change and the transition. And yeah, you'll see those skills and capabilities firsthand during the presentation today. Then also, last but definitely not least, is our colleagues from Six Capitals Advisory. Six Capitals is a dedicated ESG advisory that have been, advising, corporates and boards on ESG issues for a long time, and really, brings a kind of really practical understanding of how these issues need to be embedded into organizations, in order for it to really lead to systemic change. Now, so this project is structured at a number of levels of interaction. We have a steering committee made up of Batseta and ASISA, so the Pension Fund and Asset Management Industry Associations, and also the JSE. We also have a very broad advisory group of institutions that help, that we're engaging with to make sure that what we're doing is more broadly applicable. There's a number of levels of engagement. You know, at the top level, you know, of the easiest level to engage, there's a number of pieces of literature and communication documents that is on the website I mentioned earlier, you know, that you can download and use. There's also these, you know, these webinars and other training sessions. And then we also have, you know, kind of pilots and workshops that we'll be engaging with, you know, going forward. Information on all these engagement is on our website. And also, at the end of this webinar, we're going to do a very quick 5 to 8 minute survey just to get your views on this project, you know, on this presentation, how we can make it better. And also, there'll also be an opportunity in that survey to indicate your interest in participating further in the study. And of course, all the contact details are also on the website I mentioned earlier. So really the study has 3 broad themes. The first of which you're experiencing today is around capacity building and awareness raising, where we're trying to build a basic understanding of climate-related financial risks and opportunities, why this is important, how you engage with these issues. And then also later on, we will also be doing more advanced training during the second half of this year, or the third and fourth quarter of this year. And information of that will be on the website. And that more advanced training will specifically be will be linked to our second output, which is we're developing currently a toolkit of resources and other inputs that can help financial sector institutions in South Africa to undertake the kind of analysis and reporting that is going to be introduced today. This is going to include both tools, but also data and information sources and templates and so on. And this toolkit will form the basis for the advanced training, which we'll be doing during the next quarter. And then very excitingly, we've also we're working with our colleagues at Vivid Economics to do a best practice example of climate risk and opportunity analysis for a portfolio of 50 of the largest JSE listed companies. So we are quantifying these risks and opportunities using quite a sophisticated methodology, and we're going to put this out as a best practice disclosure example towards the end of this project. And the purpose of that is to both show what is possible in South Africa at this stage already, but also to emphasize exactly why it's important to be looking at these risks. As I mentioned previously, all the outputs from this project will be freely available. The toolkit will also be freely available, and you can use. There'll be no restrictions. All the outputs from this project is hosted on the website you can see on the screen now. There's already a number of very useful resources on there, including documents looking at the level of climate-related financial disclosure in South Africa at present. There's also a document looking at kind of best practice internationally for financial institutions and how to start the disclosure journey. There's also a very nice summary document that's pulled all of this together. That's a special publication of the Atleha-edu publication that really takes all this relative technical information and packages it in an easy to engage with format. And then very excitingly, there's also a range of fact sheets accessible from the website, where we've looked again at the disclosure of 50 of the largest companies in South Africa, actually slightly more than 50 of the largest companies. And we've provided a summary of the information they provide, and also links to where you can find this information. So that is a great resource for anyone that wants to start out on the on the TCFD journey. Right, now before we move on to the next speakers, I just quickly want to introduce our esteemed speakers for today. Firstly, we have from the WWF, we have Justin Smith, who is the head of business development at WWF South Africa, where he oversees business partnerships, marketing and fundraising activities for the organization. He also has a long history in directing ESG activities of corporates. Justin is previously the co-chair of the United Nations Environmental Programme Finance Initiatives in South Africa. He's also a member of the NBI's Western Cape board. He's a past stakeholder council member of the Marine Stewardship Council for South Africa. He's also a past board member of the Green Business Council, and he's a steering committee member of the UN CEO's water mandate. He's also a trustee of the Table Mountain Fund. So there's a wealth of experience, that Justin will be sharing with us shortly. Then also we have our colleague Wendy Engel from WWF on the line. Wendy is a financial sector specialist in the finance practice at WWF South Africa. She has a dual role of driving the objectives of the finance practice, and also focusing on ESG adoption and green financial solutions within the business development unit. Now, Wendy has a long history of looking at climate change issues, both in the financial sector and also in the academia and also in the NPO sector. So that really, Wendy has been thinking about mitigation issues and how companies should respond to them for a very long time. And then lastly, towards the later in the program, we'll be joined by Adrian Bertrand from Six Capital Advisory. Adrian is the co-founder and practice head of ESG at Six Capitals. Prior to that, Adrian worked as the head for Africa and Middle East of the UN supported Principles for Responsible Investment. He also served as an ESG manager at the Governance Employees Pension Fund. And currently, Adrian serves as a part-time consultant to ASISA, and in this capacity, he serves on the Secretariat for the Code for Responsible Investing in South Africa, and he also chairs the CRISA Stewardship Code Review Working Group. So again, in terms of these three speakers, is really kind of best practice in South Africa is culminates in these three speakers. It's a lot of information that they'll be imparting on you. And we hope it'll be a very interactive and interesting session. So I will stop now from my side, and I will now pass over to our colleagues from the WWF in order to get us into the meat of the presentation.
So yeah, apologies everybody for that. Just to say, what we really want to look at is some of the opportunities around identifying, assessing, managing climate-related risks, and particularly around the metrics and targets that we're using. So we know that there's been some pretty rapid developments in uptake in South Africa around the TCFD recommendations. And I think South Africa has also had a really long history of carbon disclosure project reporting. So I think we've got a really good foundation, and it's really for us to try and understand how the expectations are shifting around reporting and measurement, and what we recommend organizations take forward in terms of that into the future. So we know from a concept development perspective that climate change has got a major challenge for our global economy. And the recognition is just growing on a daily basis around the financial risks that are posed by climate issues in particular. And South Africa, on a number of levels, given our kind of energy dependence on coal, given our really big challenges around water scarcity and other issues, is particularly vulnerable to the risks associated with climate change. So from a Financial Stability Board perspective, the work that was done to really put forward the TCFD disclosures has taken, I think, the discussion around the risk elements of climate into the kind of next level, both in terms of physical and transition risks as well. So in terms of physical risk, I think it's probably what we're most familiar with. Some of the risks most closely related to the direct operations and supply chains of most organizations. And some of that shows through with things like flooding, with other impacts that can really disrupt the supply chains and disrupt the ability to operate of organizations in particular. We've seen obviously the risks in terms of future cash flows around the frequency or severity of extreme events. Probably most kind of recently in Germany and other parts of Europe, extreme flooding causing unexpected consequences on a level that hasn't been predicted by any of the modeling or any of the kind of organizations that work in that space in Europe. Coupled with that, we've got at the moment, and we've massive wildfires in big parts of Europe, in big parts of California, big parts of Australia as well. And those have been happening at a frequency level that are way off any of the prediction scales as well. Right now, our colleagues in WWF in Greece and Turkey are rallying to try and support some of the impacts of those wildfires at the moment. And we've seen massive parts of California and the western parts of the states also acting with that at the moment. So that leads to increased credit risk, particularly in the banking space or as well as in the insurance space. But these are just some of the examples of the shifts in climate that we're seeing. And I think some of the predictions that we know for South Africa that have been sort of most widely reported is really around the western part of our country becoming drier, and that having a major impact on the agricultural sector, which is a big part of the economy in the western part of South Africa. Certainly we'd seen these predictions for more than 10 or 15 years, and when the kind of day zero circumstances hit directly, it's probably happened a lot faster than anybody actually thought. We've seen also very specifically some of the impacts over the last couple of years. I think Wendy's back on board, so she's going to take over from me. She, as the agricultural expert, is much better placed to unpack some of this for you. Or we may have lost Wendy again, and in which case, let me carry on. And hopefully my Woolworths experience helps a little bit from an agri perspective too. But you'll see that the droughts kind of through 2017-18, and still in fact impacting parts of the Western Cape, Eastern Cape, and Northern Cape, have had a major impact in terms of some of the key production sectors. I think well known within the fruit sector and within the wine industry, but also underlying in the vegetables and grain space. So these are consequences for our food production in South Africa that are really shocking and worrying. Fortunately, we've had relatively good crops the last couple of years. But also was reading today that at a global level, disruptions in kind of climate impacts, as well as the impacts of COVID-19 on supply chains, have driven up food prices 31% since July 2020. And if we have another major impact from a drought perspective combined with these issues, it's only going to create more food security challenges for South Africa. In terms of transition risk, another really major impact for South Africa. We are on multiple levels at risk in terms of our particular dependence from a energy perspective around coal, the future sort of prognosis in terms of oil and liquids, but also in terms of the other industries in South Africa, like automotive production. As the rest of the world shifts in terms of their expectations and commitments around climate as well, you know, there's a very big chance that we're going to be producing materials and products from a South African perspective that there's going to be no demand in many big kind of trading partners across the world as well. So that value at risk is obviously pretty gigantic if you look at $120 billion that's put forward there. But we're seeing these kind of policy changes and commitments around carbon prices and carbon taxes happening on a really frequent basis. And that could leave South Africa with a really big issue in terms of stranded assets going forward. So I think many of the people on the call would have heard conversations around the idea of a just transition in South Africa. And that's really trying to address some of these challenges where we've got, you know, major investment in the coal mining sector and related kind of opportunities around it. And we need to find new avenues for transitioning those jobs into a future economy that retains employment opportunities in a country that's got the highest unemployment rate in the world, but also make sure we start moving towards meeting South Africa's commitments from a climate perspective. So you'll see there the transition risk is a really big economic issue for South Africa, and there's a number of different commodities that contribute to our balance of trade that are very vulnerable. On the positive side, we also know that there's increasing demand for electric vehicles, for renewable energy development and construction in many parts of the world. And some of the materials and commodities that we do mine in South Africa and produce will have increased demand, hopefully, into the future. So there's a bit of a balance to be found here, but generally our massive dependence on coal and puts us at a very big disadvantage here. And we really need to think cleverly about future investment into the sector and which key commodities will be competitive for us into the next 10, 20, 30 years. If you look at how this kind of plays out in practice, we've seen a number of our key financial institutions producing really good TCFD reports over the last couple of years. Nedbank, Investec, ABSA, in particular, FirstRand also have done very good reports recently. And they start trying to understand and unpack for their potential exposure how these different risks are going to play out in practice. So one, really quick example on screen there for you. But really, I think starting to think through these issues and understand what the impacts are for your particular financial institution is really critical. Making sure that there's a governance process around discussing, looking at mitigation measures, making sure that there's oversight in terms of the practice and progress that's happening within your organization, really important as well. And we've seen some very specific integrations into risk processes within the banks to really understand the climate issues and make sure that there's a really good kind of risk register process around kind of continuing to track them as well. Another good example from ABSA's perspective, also really unpacking some of the sensitive sectors that they feel risk exposure for their investment, for their lending books into the future as well. So I think unsurprising, what you'll see there in terms of energy and water supply, really strong connections in terms of real estate, obviously, particularly from a physical risk perspective, and then around the impacts of climate change in terms of agriculture, fishing, and forestry as well. But all of these different sectors have very specific links and issues that do come through. So in construction materials, for instance, cement is a really climate intensive process as well. So we've seen changes happening across the world in terms of materials that are used in construction. And we need to think about what those opportunities might be for South Africa going forward as well. So if we look at some of the methods and tools to measure climate-related financial risks, our colleagues at DNA and Vivid Economics who we're working with on the project are really, really far more capable in this space than we are, but really understanding stress testing, scenario analysis is key opportunities for us going forward. So from a TCFD perspective, there's a really strong call to integrate these opportunities and methods into the way that you're managing climate risks within your organization. And we know it's no small ask, and there's a lot of development and understanding that still needs to happen within the sector for this to go forward. But I think at least starting to grapple with this for our financial institutions in South Africa is an important first step in this process. So in terms of the scenario analysis space, transition scenarios are obviously one of the key issues that need to be looked at, looking at what are the socioeconomics and technology trajectories that could lead to very different carbon emissions and concentration levels, and what does that mean for the economy and for particular financial sector institutions as well. How to model these in terms of some of the metrics we have going forward, and then looking at the potential climate impact scenarios and what that means for the organization and its investment portfolio, its lending portfolio, etc. as well. There's been a lot of work done around this space by a number of different organizations, both globally and more recently within the South African component as well. So I think we're starting to really develop and build our skills in that regard, and hopefully we'll be able to take some of that forward as well. There's also a wide range of tools and approaches available that do have more information around how this plays out from a finance sector perspective. So UNEP FI looked at a number of different physical and transition tools and at least looked at what that might mean for the different financial institutions that belong to UNEP FI. So yeah, please do have a look at the publications that they've put forward there. And if you are interested in more information, it's a good place to just start understanding some of the different tools available. Yeah, I see this is not coming out very clearly on the screen, but again, does have a very nice kind of mapping methodology in terms of the different tools that have been assessed and the sort of different capabilities and information sets that are available for them. So do have a look at those links, and hopefully we can share them in the chat as well. So again, mapping at various temperature scenarios, you'll see there 2-degree level, 3-degree level, 4-degree level, etc. Obviously, we're really pushing to the 1.5-degree level at least. So do play with the different models and have a look at those scenarios within that framework. I think what we've also seen is that there are a number of different service providers available who are playing a much stronger role in that space. So there's a slight reference to some of them there on the bottom left, including MSCI, Climate Finance, etc. We know that locally, beyond DNA Economics and Vivid Economics, we've also seen the NBI and BCG starting to do some work in this space. And hopefully that does really build more capability in South Africa to use these tools appropriately as well. So in terms of the metrics recommended from a TCFD perspective, really critical to look at what those are being used by the organization. disclosing scope 1, scope 2, and if appropriate, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And I would say it's almost always appropriate to disclose scope 3, depending on the sector that you're in. But we know from many sectors, the scope 3 emissions are a magnitude of scale bigger often than scope 1 or 2, particularly in your kind of retail, food and beverage, and related sectors with big value chain impacts as well. But I think the more and more we understand the kind of scope 3 emissions around investments and around the kind of lending space, the better that's going to be for everybody in the sector to kind of shift their approach going forward. So TCFD also really recommends describing the targets used by the organization to manage the risks and opportunities and what the performance is against those targets as well. And I think this is the kind of area that we've really seen a bit of a weak point in South Africa. There's not been a lot of organizations that have set very clear and specific science-based targets. And we'd really like to obviously try and shift that in a more positive way into the future as well. So in terms of, again, examples around the disclosure space, if we look at ABSA Group, pretty basic in terms of at least looking at the scope 1, 2, and 3 in terms of the way forward, but a lot to be done in terms of underlying kind of assumptions, in terms of underlying understanding of what the company needs to do going forward as well. Santam as another example as well. And I think Santam is quite interesting in terms of its agricultural exposure in particular, and seeing that within the framework of the broader Sanlam group as well. We're hoping to really work with Sanlam to kind of push forward in this space into the future, but at least a good kind of first effort in terms of their disclosure results around this. And then Investec, as I mentioned earlier, we really feel have done a good job in terms of their TCFD reporting to date. So quite an interesting bit of detail, at least around their kind of energy portfolio. And you'll see that's really one of the critical things going forward is understanding the exposure from a kind of investment and lending portfolio, and how that shift is happening and how it's aligned to the kind of policies that have been put in place around divestment from kind of fossil fuels, and really trying to manage that into the future as well. So in terms of things to consider when selecting metrics and targets, it's really important for us to have a look at that through the investment lens, the lending and insurance decision-making lens as well. And then, fairly simplistically, obviously, are through the key operations and how those might be impacted by climate risk as well. Target setting is obviously a useful tool to try and track the efforts and progress to reduce your climate change exposure, and really also try and identify opportunities in terms of where the shifts might be from a demand perspective into the future as well. I think really key that the target should be embedded in governance processes. It's important to understand which board committees got accountability for oversight in the space. What are the internal kind of executive responsibilities, the integration into the risk processes in the organization, and who's responsible for kind of checking progress and making sure that that's appropriately disclosed to the stakeholders of the organization as well. We know that availability and reliability of data is a challenge. We know it's critical when selecting the metrics and targets, but it is an area that I think needs a lot of attention still, particularly in terms of disclosure around the portfolio space. The kind of direct operational impacts, I think we've seen a lot of kind of maturity develop, but the portfolio space was an area we felt that there's a lot of room to really improve as well. And then beyond the sort of quantitative data, there's obviously a need to really look at what additional metrics we can use to kind of describe progress, explain the shifts in strategy, the shifts and responses that you're making to some of the impacts that you're seeing already. And then finally, I think understanding how you distinguish and kind of really drive the scope 1 and 2 versus scope 3 emissions in terms of the management oversight and the management processes. So I think very quick one, and hopefully everybody on the course is pretty familiar with scope 1, 2, and 3. In South Africa, scope 2, because of the really high kind of coal impact of our energy system, is often a really big contributor to your overall greenhouse gas emissions. So pretty high, and one that's not often easy to kind of shift your kind of burden away from. Hopefully, as the growth around renewable energy investment and the, I think, ability of organizations to directly procure or develop up to 100 megawatts, and as we see some investment hopefully in wheeling in South Africa as well, this will be an area that's got a little bit more flexibility. But right now, it's been a real challenge for many years for most of our organizations. And then I think from a scope 3 perspective, the indirect emissions, as I mentioned earlier, depending on the sector, can be a really massive contributor. Many of the big retail organizations, food and beverage companies, have assessed that their scope 3 emissions are 5 to 10 times bigger than their scope 1 and 2 combined. So it's important for understanding and managing what those organizations are doing, how they're engaging with their suppliers because of that big responsibility around scope 3 as well. For kind of more service organizations in the financial sector, it's often more related though to obviously your business travel, procurement, waste, water, etc. But increasingly understanding all of those indirect connections is going to be really, really critical from a portfolio perspective in particular. So as I said earlier, I think South Africa has been quite a shining light in many ways in terms of the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP. So I think almost a kind of 15-year history around reporting from a carbon perspective that shifted into CDP, also looking at water issues, also looking at forests and deforestation issues. But yeah, traditionally from a carbon perspective, South Africa has been one of the key kind of countries around reporting and has done very, very well in terms of driving that disclosure. The reasons why it's important to look at CDP and consider the reporting space is really because of the investor demand and investor push around that disclosure. We've seen both in the investor space and now increasingly also the kind of major buyers who are putting a lot of pressure on in terms of disclosure around CDP. And that results in almost 10,000 companies reporting on CDP over the course of time. Also important, I think, is to see that there is a very strong focus on cities. And I think one of the issues for us is really trying to look at how we work together between local governments and business around managing climate impacts and climate risks as well. So it's an interesting space and an interesting repository to just understand what some of the key cities are doing. In South Africa, most of our big metropolitans are also part of the C40 program around managing climate issues at a global level. Many of them have got their own sort of climate strategies and plans have been put in place over the next few years. So it's really an interesting area to look at and consider supporting and working with the cities around their planning in this regard. I know that there's I think a webinar through the National Business Initiative, C40 and WWF next week, just trying to create some opportunities for business in the cities to impact on this particular topic. And we'll share some more information in the chat around that as well. So I think one of the critical pushes around CDP is really what they see as the tangible business benefits to be gained for disclosing appropriately and responding to these stakeholder requests as well. Obviously, one of the key issues is from a reputational perspective and trying to build that trust through the transparency of disclosing as broadly as possible. Hopefully boosting your competitive advantage as well. We've seen that obviously companies, very generally who have got a strong kind of ESG framework, a good disclosure process as well, can engage really openly with investors, with asset managers, and hopefully try and position themselves appropriately in that regard as well. I think getting ahead of regulation has suddenly become a really critical part of this process as well, because we know that there's increasingly an expectation to report on all of these different areas, including TCFD, and in a number of different jurisdictions, that's becoming a mandatory requirement as well. Hopefully, as these sort of different climate risks are assessed within your organization and the kind of need to disclose them is considered, it does uncover some new risks and opportunities as well. Often bringing together different parts of the organization, different business units to kind of unpack what the challenges and opportunities are, do kind of let new opportunities emerge. And hopefully that's the case for most of the organizations in the finance sector as well. And then I think finally, tracking and benchmarking progress is pretty critical. making sure that you're not seen as an outlier within your particular sector in terms of poor performance, and that there's a real need to kind of show that there's been progress over time as well in terms of the achievement of the targets that have been set and in terms of the maturity of the disclosure. So I'm going to really just hone in.
Justin, sorry, I wonder just, I mean, just to, both to give you a bit of a breather. Shame, sorry, given that this wasn't supposed to be a one continuous session, to give you a bit of a breather, and also just to see if there are any questions from the, from the audience before we go into the case study. And I guess while people are thinking about that, I mean, just to reiterate what you said previously, I mean, in terms of looking at the fact sheets, that WWF and Six Capitals had drawn up. I mean, they looked at 54 of the largest JSE listed companies, and all but one of those companies had disclosed information against at least one of the four pillars of the TCFD. So just to reiterate your point that actually the very widespread prevalence of CDP in South Africa has really given us a bit of a head start on TCFD, and I don't think this is something that people actually realize. I mean, we were certainly surprised, when we looked at that. So yeah, I think you very good to highlight that, because I think people should build on the experience of the of the CDP. And then also, again, I mean, just to confirm what you said earlier in terms of the metrics and targets, we actually found that so almost 90% of the sample disclosed their emissions, but it was largely scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. There was some scope 3 emissions, but no real financed scope 3 emissions either. So there's still a bit of work to do in terms of getting that right. But at least the vast majority of companies are now reporting their emissions. And also in terms of targets, we found that actually 62% of that sample of 54 large companies had targets in place. But again, those targets, they typically refer to scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So even though they're important to have, if we do want to support a low carbon transition, I think it's important to look at the whole. It's important to look at the whole chain. Well, that's very. Tabutwalo is just popped up a comment which is very very relevant to what I'm just saying. Yes, Tabu. So in terms of the greenhouse gas protocol, financed emissions, so the emissions from your investments, is a subsection of scope 3 emissions. So it sits. So while your business travel and your supply chain and all of that is under scope 3, there is a specific subcategory called financed scope 3 emissions, and that's where you would report your emissions from your investments. Okay, and then so again, I mean, also very closely linked to the section that Justin is about to present. Also, what we found, well, I say we as a project with my colleagues at WWF and Capitals found when they looked at the fact sheets, is that even though actually most of these 54 companies had targets, only 2 companies had targets that are explicitly Paris aligned. So only 2 companies had targets that are actually aligned to science. So I think this is where Justin's next section is going to be very important, because I think there's been an increasing focus internationally, particularly from investors, in wanting context to targets. I think just targets on their own is good, but it's a start. I think people now want to see how targets are actually supporting the move to a low carbon transition and the move to net zero, which I think is becoming more and more prevalent. And then my last point, just to see if there are any more questions before I hand back to Justin, is I think what the IPCC 6 assessment report has really struck home for me, at least, is even if you look at the TCFD, the recommendation that came out in 2017, there was a bit of a focus on, so in terms of physical risk, it was really focusing on water. And this kind of idea that the physical risks are coming, we should start getting ready for them, and at some point they're going to become important. Whereas I think what the 6th assessment report has done is it showed us that physical risks are here. Weather systems have changed. Extreme events are more likely. So what was an idea a couple of years ago, I think is now reality. I think its physical risk is now here, and it's very important to start focusing on that. Okay, so if there are no more questions, Justin, if you're sufficiently re-energized, I will hand back to you to give us what looks like a very exciting section.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brent. I mean, it has been actually a really big question. WWF's at a global level quite involved with science-based targets and has been since inception. And we've always really wondered why South Africa is kind of lagging in this space, given the really good work that's happened over quite an extended period of time with CDP. So hopefully we can start figuring out, and it would be great for any of the organizations on the call just to kind of pop in the chat what their challenges might have been around looking at science-based targets. Certainly, we've only seen kind of just more than a handful of South African companies really go through the whole journey. But given that versus the international space, it really is an interesting scenario. Alrighty, so science-based targets are really part of a broader process. And from a WWF perspective, it fits into what we're calling a new deal, really. And it's both on the climate and the biodiversity loss space, an expectation that we're going to have intergovernmental agreements and very particular targets. We already have the Paris Agreement in the climate space, the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting this year and early into next year. We're hoping that there'll be a Paris equivalent for biodiversity as well. And then really try and work with the business community to try and align their commitments and targets in that space. So that's where the SBTI side and SBTN fits in on the left. Really trying to make sure that once you've got targets, that there's a trajectory in terms of very particular projects, investments, and shifts in terms of your business model. And then I think finally the advocacy space as well, which again traditionally South African companies have not been very strong in sort of venturing into, but trying to really highlight and push for global momentum and global shifts, working not only with your own government but also at an intergovernmental level around the expectations and the sort of speed of what we'd like to see around both climate and biodiversity issues. So SBTI, or science-based targets, is a collaboration, as I mentioned briefly, between WWF, the World Resources Institute, the UN Global Compact, and CDP, and sort of underwritten with the We Mean Business Coalition. So quite a big group of organizations trying to establish and drive progress in this regard as well, and hoping that this will become really the sort of key standard in terms of businesses setting their targets and aligning to the Paris Agreement in terms of the shift towards a net zero future for all of us as well. I think what's really key in terms of the SBTI space is the idea of having rigorous, credible, and sustainability commitments. And that's where really the science base comes in, making sure that what you as an organization are committing to is very clearly aligned to what your government needs to be doing and what kind of globally needs to be going and happening as well. Hopefully that there's quite a transparent kind of proactive management of the risks that are involved around it. And then finally also that, doing this will lead to improvements in sustainability performance, increase in terms of the reputational side again, or the profiling side in terms of your customer base and your broader stakeholder base. And I think critically also showing those positive shifts and signals in terms of the investor space and in terms of building confidence around that kind of shift towards a net zero world. So we know science-based targets are by definition credible and rigorous because they are grounded in what we have available at the moment in terms of kind of scientific analysis, looking at the different limits we have as well from a planetary perspective, and being very clear that they need to be measurable and time-bound as well. Hopefully SBTI can really help an organization to look at the different steps and the different priorities that they need to action in terms of changing their trajectories, looking at what's important from a financial disclosure perspective as well. And then also really looking at where there's been quite significant uptake and alignment from the corporate sector around the UN Sustainable Development Goals, how SBT aligns and works with the UN SDGs, as well as with the Task Force for Climate related disclosures, and the TNFD, which I'll touch on a little bit in a moment as well. we know again that there's big parts of the world where a lot of this reporting, a lot of this, the kind of framework adoption is becoming mandatory. So we're going to see more and more good examples, hopefully, to kind of learn from across the world in this regard. So SBTI has really been working very hard in the organization, supporting it to kind of build the technical foundations around adoption of science-based targets, working to really engage with the corporate sector around adoption of science-based targets as well. And as I said, in South Africa, that's been quite an interesting challenge. Targets are submitted to the SBTI organizations for independent assessment. So you get quite immediate feedback in terms of the kind of level of detail and the targets that you set at an organizational level and how they do align as well. And then I think trying to push that kind of mainstreaming of science-based targets. As Ben said, this is not an issue that's purely in the climate space. We know in the water side, there's more and more of a push towards context-based water targets. There's science-based targets for nature, as I said, that I'll touch on as well. So that kind of alignment of commitments at an organizational level is really quite a big critical thematic, and one that I think we need to really think about quite carefully. So as I said, we do have the Paris Agreement globally as the sort of framework that we're trying to drive business alignment with, and city alignment as well. So the timeframes, the kind of degrees that we're looking at are quite critical. Science-based targets, when it started, was looking at both 1.5 degree and 2 degree scenarios, but the 2 degree scenarios are now being phased out, and I'll chat a little bit more about that as well. Partly with the research that we've seen in the different reports, like the IPCC reports since 2015, and what we've learned from that perspective. And I think fairly simplistically, our long-term goal here is to move as many organizations and indeed the sort of global economy and all of the country commitments to reach net zero emissions within the time frame and carbon budget that the Paris Agreement has set. I think what's important to say, though, is if you look at that sort of graph there, is that the trajectory of each organization and indeed each sector can be quite different as well. So there's not necessarily a very linear one. There may be different steps and different methodologies to kind of get to that space. But that's where some of the more kind of sector-specific guidance does come in as well. So from a quick process perspective, first step really is to put a letter of commitment in place that you do intend to set a science-based target. That doesn't mean that you've done the underlying analysis, that you've got a clear idea of what the goal might be, but that you as an organization really want to make sure you're aligning to what kind of global best practices in terms of science-based targets. And at the same time, once that's submitted, how do you develop and work on that emission reduction target? Sometimes it's quite a lengthy process, and I think there's about a 2-year kind of period that's given to organizations to work on that kind of development of a target, look at the different sort of support and guidance that's in place to achieve it, then submitting the target to SBTI when you're ready for that, for official validation. Once that's been validated, there'll be a communications kind of process around announcing the target, informing stakeholders. And then obviously from a disclosure perspective, really looking at making sure that that's a key and critical part of your climate disclosure going forward, and that progress is as transparently presented to your different stakeholders as possible over time. So what we've seen at the moment is that there has been quite a significant growth since inception. We're kind of nearing 1,500 companies at the moment globally that have formally joined SBTI. Of those, just more than half, and again about 750 of companies with approved targets. And we're seeing between kind of 25 to 40 companies signing up every month at the moment. So there has been a lot of growth and development and quite a sort of speed and uptake. And I think increasingly recently also driven by TCFD and the kind of impact it's had on the business industry as well. Having seen that growth in terms of SBTI, the kind of next scope of this, and a really critical point, but one that I don't want to kind of scare anybody on the call with at the moment, is that we're really looking at climate and biodiversity loss as being the two global gigantic challenges that we need to face. And we do need to think about them in an integrated fashion because they are so interconnected and do so influence each other strongly in terms of the potential impacts around them, that we are now looking at the science-based targets for nature coming through as well. And that hopefully that alignment and that work will start integrating climate and biodiversity considerations more effectively in the way that both governments and countries respond in this regard. From a South African perspective, you'll see a relatively slow uptake. We have had kind of 5 or 6 other companies, particularly in the retail sector, who have made a commitment to set science-based targets, but have kind of struggled over time and kind of dropped off the list because they haven't submitted within the necessary timeframes. But a couple of key companies who do have approved targets, Hulaman, Sibanye-Stillwater, Emira Properties, Woolworths as examples there, across sort of quite different sectors in some ways, and sectors, I think, importantly, with very specific impacts from a climate perspective. So Woolies, obviously, from a value chain, particularly in their foods business in South Africa, but also their global kind of clothing supply chain, needing to do a lot of analysis to really put a target in place. Yeah, we've got about 15 or 20 companies that we are in discussion with at the moment around setting science-based targets and really trying to support them on that journey. But again, it's been for me a really strange scenario of South African companies not really making commitments and not kind of moving in this regard. So if there are any thoughts in terms of why that hasn't happened, really value that feedback. It's quite useful for us to kind of feed that into the global team as well. So from a science-based targets perspective, mentioned earlier that there's a lot of technical foundation work that's done. So the alignment around greenhouse gas inventories being aligned with GHG protocol accounting standards, a lot of resource documentation and kind of technical guidance that's available as well, that forms almost the underlying foundation of SBTI. So a lot of these different documents are on the SBTI website as well as on the various partner websites and are a really strong part of kind of taking this forward. From an organizational perspective, obviously one of the first steps is establishing a baseline in terms of carbon footprint, but that's a baseline both at a kind of absolute level as well as in terms of a number of different measures around carbon intensity. And that's quite critical depending on what different methodologies you then use to sort of plot your targets going forward. Hopefully through that process, it's also going to help you look at what are the key hotspots from an emission perspective in your value chain and where you should be prioritizing to kind of put your resources and really drive action going forward. And I think as you sort of map this in terms of that trajectory to get to net zero, it also really critically needs to kind of take into account how much your business is going to grow over that period as well, so that you're not just reducing off what the size of your organization or the size of your kind of economic basis is now, but also understanding how that's going to shift over time. So I mentioned the kind of scope 1, 2, 3 space earlier. And really, again, I just want to emphasize that as much as scope 1 and 2 is a challenge in itself, it's really important to start digging into your upstream and downstream scope 3 kind of impacts as well and understand what they might mean for the organization going forward. And particularly critical to do this as part of the science-based targets process. So at a minimum, the boundary does need to look at your kind of key scope 1 and 2 emissions. The time frame needs to at least be a 5 to 15 year kind of trajectory into the future. Understanding what progress has been made to date in terms of your organization and also what that forward-looking ambition is going to be for the organization as well. And then obviously a commitment to be reporting on an annual basis in terms of how your GHG emissions inventory is shifting. And as I said just a minute or two ago, and apologies for the repetition, but I really can't emphasize enough for certain industries that scope 3 emissions are super, super critical to take into account properly. And we know that there's been more of a challenge around measuring those appropriately, but even having a sort of good estimation and using that as the basis can be really, quite a massive shift in terms of what your climate impact is at an organizational level. So where those scope 3 emissions are material, it's really critical to have an ambitious and measurable scope 3 target. So that 2 degrees scenario is one that is being shifted out now, because we've just realized and we've seen from the science that that's not going to help us in any way dealing with the major climate challenges we have at a global level. So that 1.5 degree trajectory is really where the majority of the commitments have been coming over the last few years, and that where all of the new commitments are going to be needed as well. In terms of renewable energy, I think another important point, having targets in place to actively source and develop renewable energy is really critical to being able to figure out what your pathway is going to be to shift your emissions down. That again has been a challenge in South Africa in many respects, given the sort of uneven development and the kind of political issues that have come around the renewable energy space. But hopefully we are on a much clearer commitment and a sort of more positive signal, I guess, around renewables into the sort of short, medium, long term now. So scope 3 screening is important as a kind of first step. And then when, as I said, scope 3 emissions cover a significant portion of your total emissions, greater than 40%, that it really is important to make sure you've got scope 3 plans included in your commitments going forward. There's 2 different types of scope 3 emission or scope 3 targets that are also being utilized broadly at the moment. One is around emission reductions, and then also another one around supply engagement targets. And that's really important from an influence perspective. If you, as a key kind of part of the economy, are able to work with your supplier base to really help them develop and understand their own targets from a climate perspective, that's an incredibly positive kind of impact that your organization can have as well, and one that's majorly encouraged in terms of really pushing out the kind of emissions reductions that we need to see from an economy perspective. So in terms of the emission reduction targets, we obviously do want to see the kind of level of ambition around the thresholds that are being put in place. There's a few different methodologies and mechanisms, which I think I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right now on, but where we do at an organizational level through WWF, the World Resources Institute and others, work with companies to help them assess which is going to be most appropriate to their particular country scenario, the context of their industry, as well as the potential kind of supply chain impacts that they do have as well. And I think that sort of support and guidance is quite important, particularly for a lot of the developing economies that we work with as well. We have seen some interesting kind of developments and different options being put forward as well from different sector actors already. So Levi Strauss there as an example, reducing absolute scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services by 40% by 2025. So just in sort of a 10-year time period trying to achieve that. Seiko looking at how they're reducing scope 3 emissions from goods and services at a product per unit of value level by almost 50%. And then Royal DSM looking at how to reduce scope 3 emissions, upstream transport and distribution, as well as waste at a per ton of product level as well. So I think each of these different opportunities and different options in terms of what the metric is you want to use and how you use that within your scope 3 targets going forward. Given all the kind of developments we've seen in the science-based target space, and I think what I've tried to really say around each sector having a very different context that needs to be taken into account. Science-based targets started a program in 2018 to really look at a financial sector supplement or financial sector specific kind of project so that there is more guidance in terms of aligning the lending and investment portfolios in particular with the Paris Agreement. So I think about 30 or 40 pilot financial institutions across commercial banks, asset managers and owners, mortgage, real estate, investment trusts, etc., participating in kind of a pilot process over about 18 months to really work and test what the best options would be in terms of the financial institution space. So a lot more resources available, again, to have a look at if you are interested in taking this forward in terms of the criteria, the tools, the guidance, documentation, and the different suggested methods for the finance sector to really look at integrating this going forward. As we really look at integration and alignment as being key, we need to understand that the basis that's been set around science-based targets and the very strong climate impact that they're trying to address does need to integrate biodiversity and nature loss as well. So SPTN, a lot of work being done at the moment to develop understanding, models and resources for it, and really trying to bring it on board in an integrated fashion around how both businesses and cities will be looking at biodiversity and climate in a interconnected fashion that they really do exist. The other quite big shift at the moment that's happening from a science-based target space is around the SBTi net zero standard. So there's a development process that's really happening at the moment around the kind of criteria to properly assess net zero commitments. Quite a substantial public consultation process and guidance documentation process that's happening. Second kind of set of consultations and testing with a number of different participants in different sectors. And then hopefully the finalization of a net zero standard late in 2021 to help guide organizations in terms of that particular trajectory as well. So that's a really quick whip through the science-based target space. And I think maybe just to sum up again, we really want to work with as many South African companies as possible who are keen to align their commitments to what's happening at a global level and what's happening at a national commitment level as well. And the different science-based targets partners are very keen to support and guide organizations through that process. So as much as it is challenging, we're not going to leave you out there on your own to do that. So if there's anybody who's interested in taking this forward, please do get in touch with the team. While this is happening, and I realize it's already a challenge because we haven't seen major uptake in the climate aspects of science-based targets, there's a global movement to integrate biodiversity at the same time. And then finally, that commitment to understand the terminology and the meaning of net zero within the science-based target space and how that's going to impact some of the existing commitments and the way that future commitments are being set as well. So let me stop there. Thanks very much, Brent. Not sure if you want to add anything as well. I know you've got a lot of experience in this space too. And then just checking if there are any questions or comments from the audience.
Hi, Justin, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. That was a great session. I think just before we introduce, our colleague Adrian Bertrand, who's joined us, as you would have seen from the chat, to do the Q&A session, I wonder, Justin, there was a few polling questions from WWF. So I wonder, if Safako, if you could please load those now. And Justin, maybe you can quickly talk us through the polling sessions to get people's minds working and ready for the for the session by Adrian.
Sure, thanks. A fairly simple one, I guess, Brent. Just really trying to understand from the audience which of the different risks between physical and transition risk organizations are most familiar with. And I mean, neither is also a very valid answer for companies that are early in their journey. But I think, as we probably expect so far, quite a lot of understanding around physical risk and how that affects your organization.
Yeah, no, this is a great outcome given the point of our project to try and help people understand transition risk better. So hopefully at the end of this project the numbers will look a bit different, but it does seem like there's quite a good understanding of the physical risk. Okay, I don't think the numbers are moving much anymore. So I was wondering, yeah, Justin, are there any more polling questions, or was up? There we go.
I what we also need to understand is that the context of impacts are really different in developed economies versus developing economies. And the key kind of dependency on sectors also plays a role here. So really just trying to get some feedback from the team, from the audience around those issues.
Yeah, that's a really interesting result. Yeah, okay. So people seem to think that it's, you know, everyone is equally vulnerable. Yeah, well, everyone is certainly vulnerable. Yeah, I guess we need a bit more work to understand exactly where the, you know, yeah, where the biggest vulnerability is. But I think there's no doubt that everyone is vulnerable. Maybe just what, you know, while we're finishing up the poll, just to mention, so you would have seen we went through scenarios quite quickly as part of this session. The reason for that is towards the end of next month that we are having a separate training session that will be much more technical and much more focused on, you know, on scenarios and what they are and how to use them. And also, you know, if you go to the, you know, to the website address we showed earlier, there's also some, you know, 2 training sessions for asset managers, and then longer sessions for asset managers, and then a longer session for pension funds. We will also be dealing with these issues in, you know, in a bit more detail. So this really was the introduction to the topics. So we really hope that you'll join us for some of those sessions to get a bit of a deeper understanding of these issues. And then, of course, as we mentioned at the beginning, during the, you know, towards the end of the year, we will be having another session, you know, of training, these webinars where we'll be focusing on, you know, kind of that best practice and how to use the toolkit, and so there'll be another opportunity to learn from this and to get a much deeper understanding of the issues we touched on today. But having said that, we still have quite a bit of time, and we are, you know, so I think if there are any more questions, I think now would be a great time to raise them. I will hand you over to my colleague Adrian Bertrand, who, you know, from Six Capitals. I guess Adrian and the Six Capitals team with the WWF team, they are running these webinars, so they've been, you know, kind of making the magic happen. So we're very, very fortunate to have Adrian join us. Adrian, over to you.
Thanks very much, Brent, and thank you so much, Justin, for your presentation. Of course, we would have loved to have Wendy being able to present as well, but the good news is that we will be repeating this webinar for other participants next week, Tuesday. So if you'd like to join us to hear Wendy, please do join us Tuesday afternoon next week from 2 to 4. But Justin, we very much appreciate you doing the full presentation on behalf of WWF. I'm glad to see that there were a few questions which have come through, but I see, Justin, you've already responded to Manfred's question around the SBTI standards for tertiary institutions, and then that's likely to come out in the next 6 months. So I see that question's been answered. If there are other questions that participants in the webinar would like to raise, please would you let us know that you'd like to ask a question. You can raise your hand and Safako can unmute you. Otherwise, you can use the chat function. It would be great if we could have some interaction and hear from you around your own organization's personal experiences with respect to climate risk. So I see Brent is starting us off with a question, and presumably, Justin, these questions are directed to you, but Wendy, if you can respond in the chat as well, that would be great. So the question is, how do SDBI targets relate to South Africa's transition and targets?
I didn't think Brent was allowed to ask tricky questions, but I think that at a basic level, as we were saying earlier, the SBTI targets are really trying to help companies align to the Paris Agreement commitments. And under that, South Africa's got a kind of NDC that's recently been revised and been developed. So it's really trying to make sure that as companies, we support the ability of South Africa as a country to meet that NDC, which will allow it in turn to meet its kind of Paris Agreement commitments as well. So there's normally quite a strong kind of engagement process, which I think this year happened through sort of April, May, for organizations to also give input into the NDC through Department of Fisheries, Forestry and Environment, as well as through the Presidential Climate Change Commission. So hopefully all of that alignment is being kind of put into place by participation and kind of input into those processes as well.
Thanks very much for that answer, Justin, and thanks for the question, Brent. I'm waiting to see if there are any hands that are being raised. It doesn't look like that. And no questions coming through, so I'm going to take liberties and also ask a question. So we've got people from a corporate kind of background on the webinar, businesses being represented. We've also got investors represented. Perhaps kind of splitting the question in two. If you're a corporate representative in today's webinar, and they need to go back to the office and motivate to take action on climate risk, what would you as WWF, either Justin or Wendy, suggest are the top 3 actions they should consider doing to start the process of managing climate risk from an organizational perspective? Firstly, for corporates, and secondly, for investors.
Thanks, Adrian. I think from a corporate perspective, step one, I guess, is looking at what your kind of broad carbon footprint would be organizationally, so you've got somewhere to start from. I think also understanding and looking at what the existing risk processes are within the company and how you can integrate climate into those processes. So it's really not meant to be a whole lot of additional kind of committees and work and tracking, but as far as possible, making sure it's integrated into the thinking and the management that it already holds. And then I think kind of finally also reading through a couple of the key guidance points like the TCFD recommendations and knowing what that means for your organization at a high level. And then certainly, there's a number of different organizations, including many of the participants in this project, like WWF 6 Capitals, etc., that would be very happy to have a conversation around support and guidance in terms of that way forward. But yeah, I think that would be a good start from a corporate perspective. I think from the investor side, it's also really important to kind of have a clear understanding of where your sort of portfolio exposure is across key sectors. And I see Wendy's making the point there around the kind of value chain aspect as well. If you're heavily invested in the agriculture space, for instance, as an investor, knowing what the sort of short, medium, long-term implications are for those particular companies that you invested in or those particular projects is going to be really critical. We know it's probably a little bit trickier for many companies than your sort of your own direct operational side, but I think that starting to develop an understanding of that is a good start. I think in the same way, there is a lot of information, a lot of guidance available. So again, the kind of TCFD space is a good area to start, and maybe looking at a couple of key global leaders who are reporting in your particular sector, whether it be in the kind of asset management or insurance or kind of commercial banking portfolio space. Have a look at a few of those, what they're currently reporting and what they see as their big potential exposure points. And then I think, again, we've seen quite a lot of development in South Africa in terms of the level of reporting from the big banks, insurers, etc. We know that there's working groups at a sector and an industry association level, through banking association, through ASISA. We know National Treasury is doing a lot of work in the space, and JSE. So even if you're not clear in terms of what you want to be doing going forward, just start getting involved, start participating and understanding what the types of conversations are from a South African context as well.
Thanks. Very useful guidance, Justin. And thanks, Wendy, also for making your comments in the chat function. I'm not seeing any further hands or any further questions coming through. So perhaps I will ask one final question, unless we have any questions coming up. But Justin, you invited people to get in touch with the project partners for this UK PACT funded project. Just by example, what does WWF do when it comes to partnering with your corporate partners around climate? What kind of support or resources would WWF traditionally provide to your corporate partners that are wanting to address climate?
I think it's a combination of kind of awareness building, and that's part of what we're trying to do as a broader team today as well. We do have one of our colleagues who's a presidential climate change commissioner, so getting insight into what the policy discussions are, what the implications are for business as well, I think is quite critical, because we do have quite an interesting sort of framework of legislation and other kind of issues around carbon budgets, carbon taxes in South Africa. So just helping navigate through that, I think, is one of the critical areas. And then we do have two of the WWF global science-based targets team who sit in the South African office as well. So together with colleagues who sit in kind of Mexico and France and Germany and other places across the world. So we do have capacity in-house to really support and work with organizations around understanding their specific kind of pathway to a science-based target. So very keen to support any organizations who are interested in that regard.
Thanks, Justin. And I see Wendy's also mentioned in the chat function that you host the business networking events and webinars like this as well for information sharing and sharing in best practice. You'll see in the chat function that we've got a post-webinar feedback survey. If we can, as we start to wrap up, ask that you take just 5 minutes to complete that post-webinar survey. That's a requirement from the UK PACT as our funder for this project to solicit feedback from webinar participants. So please do take a few minutes to complete that for us. We'd really appreciate that. It really shouldn't take longer than 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Justin, for presenting on behalf of WWF today. Thank you very much, Brent, for your facilitation in the first half. And thank you also, Wendy, for your contribution via the slide deck, as well as contributing via the chat function in terms of responding to questions. That's much appreciated. We look forward to Tuesday's webinar on the same theme, where hopefully, Wendy, you'll be able to have more of an opportunity to speak. Just a reminder for those of you who've joined us who are retirement fund trustees or principal officers, we've got these webinars formally accredited by Batseta for Batseta CPD points. So if you're a trustee or a principal officer and you'd like to claim the 2 Batseta CPD hours, please won't you get in touch with us via email. We just need your full names and ID number, and we can then issue you with a CPD certificate having attended today's session. So we're running the second session on this theme. So it's the same presentation. So if you've benefited from today's webinar and you think you'd like one of your colleagues to join on Tuesday, please do invite them to join us on Tuesday from 2 o'clock till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And we'll be having the second of this theme webinar. We'll be starting the first of our half-day workshops aimed at asset managers also next week on the 6th of September. So on the 6th and the 7th of September, there are 2 morning half-day workshops for asset managers. The reminder email that you would have received yesterday has got the link to registering for those events. And then so that's focused on asset managers. If you are a representative of the retirement fund industry, we'd invite you to join us on the 9th of September for the first of our 2 full-day virtual workshops focused for retirement fund trustees and principal officers and advisors to retirement funds such as asset consultants. We really do hope that you've benefited from today's webinar, and hopefully you've been able to join us for all of the webinars in the series. If you would like to catch up on webinars that you may have missed, each of the webinars that have been delivered over the last number of weeks. The webinar recording, as well as the webinar slide deck, is available for download via the project resource website, which is hosted by DNA Economics, and you can see the link on the screen. I'd like to close with just some final polling questions on gender equity and social inclusion. This is a key theme for our funders, the UK PACT. And so again, aligned to one of the earlier questions posed by WWF, but the question is, do you feel gender and social inclusion concerns are being considered in the context of climate-related financial disclosures in South Africa at present? Yes, no, or not sure. So it looks like for a lot of people, you're still needing to find more information or make up your mind. So really, 30% saying no, gender and social inclusion concerns aren't adequately considered. And a number of you saying, not sure, need more information. Let's stop this poll and we can move on to the second and final poll, please, Safaku. The second question is, what priority gender equity and social inclusion issues and concerns would you like to see featured in an analysis and reporting toolkit, which is being developed by this project team? Would you like to see more guidance around gender equality, social equity, social inclusion, or not sure? So it seems a strong focus on social inclusion and equity, and also a number of people undecided, not sure, probably need a bit more information. Right, so definitely a lot in favor of social inclusion, a few in terms of social equity, and then a few not sure, need more information. Thanks very much. We can close that poll. And with that, I think the only thing that needs to be done is to thank our speakers again. Our sincere thanks to Justin Smith and Wendy Engel, as well as Brent Klutti. Thank you very much to the WWF team for today's content. We hope that you've really benefited from this as the hosting organizations, and we look forward to seeing you during our next webinar. Thanks very much and take care.